The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I watched through my office window as my father tore it open in the driveway of 847 Maple Street. Even from 2 hours away in Columbus, I knew exactly what it said because I had been the one making sure that letter would come. For 4 years, I had been the invisible hand keeping my parents' house from going to auction while they called me worthless. For 4 years, I had been paying the property taxes on a home I was thrown out of, for people who told me I would never amount to anything. My name is Sarah Torres, and the parents who said I was good for nothing just discovered their good for nothing daughter had been saving their lives in secret. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The call came at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. On a Wednesday, interrupting a client meeting where I was explaining tax optimization strategies to a small manufacturing company. The number flashing on my phone screen belonged to Amy Rodriguez, my best friend from high school who still lived in Cedar Falls. Amy never called during business hours unless something major had happened, so I excused myself and stepped into the hallway of my downtown Columbus office building. "Sarah, you need to know something." Amy's voice was barely above a whisper, like she was hiding in a bathroom stall. "Your parents just left the county courthouse, and your dad was screaming at some clerk about anonymous payments. Something about property taxes and how someone's been interfering with their business for years." She paused, and I could hear the familiar sounds of Cedar Falls Community Bank in the background where Amy worked as a loan officer. "Sarah, they know. They figured out someone's been paying their back taxes and they're furious about it." I leaned against the cool marble wall of the hallway, watching downtown Columbus bustle below through floor-to-ceiling windows. 9 years had passed since my father dragged my duffel bag to the front porch and told me I wasn't welcome in his house anymore. 9 years since my mother stood silent in the doorway while he called me a disappointment and a burden. 9 years since they decided their middle daughter was good for nothing and would only drag down the family name. "How much do they know?" I asked Amy, though I already suspected the answer. For 4 years, I had been making anonymous payments to Cedar Falls County on behalf of Robert and Linda Torres of 847 Maple Street. Every quarter, like clockwork, I sent certified funds through a legal intermediary to cover their property tax delinquency. Not because I owed them anything, but because I refused to let my younger sister Jessica lose the only home she had ever known. Because despite everything they had done to me, I couldn't stand the thought of them becoming homeless in a town where everyone would whisper about their downfall. "They know it's been going on for years," Amy continued, her voice dropping, even lower. "The clerk apparently let slip that the payments came with specific instructions about privacy and that they were always made exactly on time, always for the full amount owed plus penalties. Your dad was shouting about charity and handouts and how he never asked for help from anyone." She laughed bitterly. Classic Bob Torres, mad about the very thing that saved his house. Through the window, I watched a young woman about my age walking confidently down High Street in a tailored business suit, her phone pressed to her ear as she navigated between office buildings. 9 years ago, I had been sleeping on Amy's couch, with everything I owned stuffed into a canvas duffel bag that smelled like my father's garage. Today, I owned a thriving financial services company with 32 regular clients and 3 employees. I lived in a renovated townhouse in German Village, drove a car I paid cash for, and had more in my business savings account than my parents had ever made in a single year. But none of that success had erased the sound of my father's voice on that humid August evening when I was 18, fresh out of high school and desperate to prove that I wasn't the family failure they believed me to be. "You think you're so smart with your little bookkeeping job and your community college dreams?" he had said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed like a bouncer at a bar. "But you don't understand how the real world works, Sarah. You don't understand what it takes to provide for a family, to keep a roof over everyone's head, to make the hard decisions that adults have to make." The memory still stung, because even then, at 18, I had been the one balancing the family checkbook when my mother got overwhelmed. I had been the one who noticed they were behind on utilities and quietly picked up extra shifts at Pine Grove Diner to help cover the shortfall. I had been the one who organized their receipts every tax season and caught the errors that saved them hundreds of dollars in penalties. But somehow being useful had made me dispensable. Being competent had made me threatening. "Sarah, are you still there?" Amy's voice pulled me back to the present. "There's something else. Your mom was crying in the parking lot, and I heard her telling your dad that maybe they should call you. That maybe whoever was helping them was trying to send a message." Amy paused again, and I could picture her glancing around the bank to make sure no one was listening. "I think they're starting to put the pieces together." I closed my eyes and felt something that might have been panic or might have been relief washing over me. For 4 years, I had been able to help them from a distance to ensure they didn't lose everything while maintaining the boundary that had saved my life. But I had always known this day would come eventually. Property tax payments leave paper trails, and my parents weren't stupid, just proud. "What are you going to do?" Amy asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. She had been there during the worst of it, had seen me sleeping in my car between the couch surfing and the first real apartment. She knew what it had cost me to rebuild my life after my family decided I wasn't worth keeping. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the hallway window, seeing not the uncertain 18-year-old who had been cast out for dreaming too big, but the successful business owner who had learned to trust her own judgment above all else. "I'm going to let them figure it out," I said finally, "and then I'm going to decide what I want to say when they come asking for explanations." Because they would come. People like Robert and Linda Torres didn't let mysteries go unsolved, especially when those mysteries involved money and family and the complicated mathematics of obligation and resentment. They would want to know who had been paying their bills, why someone would do such a thing in secret, and what it meant for their carefully constructed narrative about their middle daughter who had been too stubborn and ungrateful to appreciate what they were trying to teach her. But for the first time in 9 years, I wouldn't be the one waiting by the phone, hoping for their approval or forgiveness. This time, they would be the ones wondering what I wanted from them, what I expected in return, and whether the daughter they had written off might have grown into someone they couldn't ignore. Amy was quiet for a long moment before saying, "You know what this means, don't you? If they figure out it was you, they're going to have to face the fact that their good-for-nothing daughter has been taking care of them all along." I smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. "Yeah," I said, watching that confident young woman disappear around a corner, probably heading to a meeting or a coffee date or any one of 1,000 opportunities that came with building a life on your own terms. I know exactly what it means. It meant that the girl they had thrown away for being irresponsible had become responsible enough to save their house without them even knowing it. It meant that the daughter they said would never make anything of herself had made enough of herself to quietly cover their failures while building her own success. It meant that for 4 years, every night they had slept peacefully in their beds at 847 Maple Street, they had been protected by the very person they claimed wasn't worth protecting. But most importantly, it meant that when they finally worked up the courage to call me, I would be the one deciding whether to answer. Growing up on Maple Street in Cedar Falls was like living inside a postcard that someone had carefully staged for the neighbors. Our house sat perfectly in the middle of a row of similar ranch-style homes, each with their obligatory front lawn, mailbox, and driveway leading to a single-car garage. My mother, Linda, spent her Saturday mornings edging the grass with precision that would make a military groundskeeper proud, while my father, Bob, ensured our driveway was always swept clean of leaves and our house numbers were always freshly painted, in bold black numerals. Every Sunday morning, the Torres family would walk the 4 blocks to St. Margaret's Catholic Church in a coordinated procession that had been choreographed through years of practice. My father would wear his only good D suit, the navy blue one that he reserved for weddings, funerals, and weekly displays of respectability. My mother would walk beside him in whatever dress the church ladies had complimented most recently. Her hair set in the same style she had worn since 1995. Her purse clutched tightly in both hands like it contained the family's entire reputation. My older brother Michael would stride ahead of the rest of us, already tall and confident at 16, his football letterman jacket slung over his shoulder even in the middle of summer. Everyone in town knew Michael Torres was going places. He had been starting quarterback since his sophomore year, maintained a solid B average without really trying, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made teachers overlook his occasional absences and adults predict great things about his future. Then came me, Sarah, the middle child who always seemed to be walking slightly out of step with the family rhythm. I would trail behind my parents in whatever dress my mother had deemed appropriate for a young lady of 17, my hands folded carefully in front of me, my expression arranged in what I hoped looked like serene contentment, but probably resembled barely contained restlessness. Finally, there was Jessica, my younger sister, only 14 but already showing signs of inheriting Michael's natural ease with our parents' expectations. She would skip alongside our mother, chattering about school friends and weekend plans, secure in the knowledge that she was the baby of the family, and therefore exempt from the kinds of criticisms that seemed to follow me everywhere. To anyone watching this weekly parade, we looked like the picture of small-town family values. Bob Torres, the hard-working contractor who had built half the porches in Cedar Falls. Linda Torres, the devoted wife and mother who volunteered at the church carnival every year, and never missed a PTA meeting. Their 3 children, each fulfilling their designated role in the family narrative that everyone in town had learned to recite by heart. But like most carefully constructed facades, ours began to crack the moment you looked too closely, or stayed around long enough to see what happened when the performance ended. The church ladies loved to compliment my mother on how well-behaved her children were, how respectful we seemed, how fortunate she was to have such a lovely family. "You're so blessed, Linda," they would say after services, their voices carrying the kind of wistful envy that suggested their own children weren't quite so cooperative. "Your kids are just angels. You must be doing something right." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother would smile that tight, practiced smile that I had learned to recognize as her public face, the one that never quite reached her eyes but satisfied the social requirements of the moment. "We believe in discipline," she would respond, her voice carrying just enough pride to sound humble, while making it clear that our behavior was the result of superior parenting rather than luck. What the church ladies didn't see was how that discipline manifested itself behind the closed doors of 847 Maple Street. They didn't witness the way conversations stopped abruptly when I entered a room, or how questions about my future were met with skeptical silence rather than encouraging discussion. They didn't observe the family dinners where Michael's football achievements were dissected and celebrated, while my academic accomplishments were acknowledged with curt nods and immediate subject changes. The beautiful lie of our family extended beyond Sunday morning appearances into every aspect of our public existence. When neighbors asked about Bob's construction business, he would speak confidently about upcoming projects and satisfied customers, never mentioning the invoices that went unpaid for months, or the way he had started taking on jobs that barely covered the cost of materials. When people inquired about Linda's part-time work at Henderson's department store, she would describe it as something she did to stay busy, rather than acknowledging that her 20-hour-a-week paycheck had become essential for covering basic household expenses. At school, teachers would smile approvingly when they learned I was Bob Torres's daughter, remembering him as the reliable contractor who had repaired the gymnasium roof 2 years ahead of schedule and under budget. They would assume that a girl from such a stable, hard-working family must naturally be destined for similar success, never suspecting that stability was something we performed rather than something we lived. The most insidious part of the beautiful lie was how it made questioning our family dynamics feel like betrayal. When I tried to talk to my friend Amy about feeling invisible at home or being constantly compared unfavorably to my siblings, her responses would remind me how lucky I was to have parents who cared enough to have expectations. When I mentioned feeling like my ideas weren't valued or my contributions weren't recognized, well-meaning adults would lecture me about teenage ingratitude and the importance of respecting my elders. Even I began to believe that any dissatisfaction I felt must be a character flaw rather than a reasonable response to being systematically dismissed and diminished. The narrative of our perfect family was so well established in Cedar Falls that contradicting it felt impossible, like trying to argue with gravity or insist that water wasn't wet. But the beautiful lie required constant maintenance, and by the time I turned 17, the effort of maintaining it had begun to exhaust everyone involved. Michael was spending more time at friends' houses than at home, claiming football practice and study groups, but really avoiding the increasing tension that seemed to permeate every family interaction. Jessica had started asking uncomfortable questions about why Sarah always seemed to be in trouble or why discussions about college made everyone so quiet and awkward. The cracks in our facade were becoming visible to anyone who bothered to look closely. But in a town like Cedar Falls, most people preferred the comfort of familiar narratives to the complexity of examining what lay beneath them. It was easier to believe that the Torres family had simply figured out something the rest of us hadn't, that their apparent harmony was the result of better parenting and stronger values, rather than a carefully orchestrated performance designed to hide the fact that we were slowly falling apart. The erosion of my voice in the Torres household didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like water wearing away stone, so subtle that I didn't recognize what was happening until I realized one day that I had stopped expressing opinions about anything more controversial than what to have for dinner. And even then, I usually just agreed with whatever my mother suggested. It started with the little corrections that felt reasonable, even helpful. When I was 14 and excitedly describing a book I had read for English class, my father would interrupt to point out that I was talking too fast, that I needed to slow down and think before speaking if I wanted people to take me seriously. When I offered my thoughts on a news story during dinner, my mother would gently suggest that perhaps I should learn more about complicated subjects before forming such strong opinions. These corrections always came wrapped in the language of improvement and concern. They weren't trying to silence me, they explained. They were trying to help me become a better communicator, a more thoughtful person, someone who would make a good impression on teachers and employers and future in-laws. The fact that their helpful suggestions invariably resulted in me speaking less rather than speaking better was presented as a temporary side effect, something that would resolve itself once I learned to engage with the world more appropriately. Michael, by contrast, was encouraged to share his thoughts on everything from sports to politics to family decisions. When he spoke too quickly, it was evidence of his passion and intelligence. When he offered uninformed opinions, it was proof that he was thinking critically and developing his own worldview. The same behaviors that earned me gentle corrections earned him approving nods and follow-up questions designed to draw him out further. The double standard was so consistent that I began to assume there must be something fundamentally different about the way Michael and I expressed ourselves, some quality in his communication style that made his contributions valuable while mine were disruptive. I started studying the way he talked, trying to identify what made his words welcome while mine seemed to create uncomfortable silences or subtle eye rolls between my parents. What I eventually realized was that Michael's opinions rarely challenged anything my parents already believed or wanted to believe. When he expressed enthusiasm for his football coach's new training regimen, it supported my father's belief that discipline and hard work were the keys to success. When he complained about teachers who gave too much homework, it reinforced my parents' suspicion that schools were becoming too demanding and losing sight of practical education. My observations, on the other hand, had a troubling tendency to point out inconsistencies or raise questions that made everyone uncomfortable. When I mentioned that our church's emphasis on helping the poor seemed to conflict with their opposition to social programs, It created the kind of theological discussion that my parents preferred to avoid. When I wondered aloud why my father's business always seemed to be struggling despite his reputation for quality work, it forced acknowledgement of financial realities that everyone preferred to keep private. The solution, I learned through repeated experience, was to align my contributions with existing family beliefs, or simply remain quiet. Conversations became much smoother when I limited myself to asking questions that had obvious answers or expressing enthusiasm for things that everyone already agreed were good. The more I practiced this kind of careful communication, the more I realized how much of my actual thinking I had learned to keep to myself. By the time I was 16, the diminishing had become so complete that I sometimes felt like a stranger in my own family's conversations. I would sit at the dinner table listening to discussions about Michael's latest achievements or Jessica's social dramas, waiting for a natural opportunity to contribute something meaningful, only to realize that I had no idea how to insert my actual thoughts into these carefully curated exchanges. The most painful part wasn't the silence itself, but the way I had begun to internalize my parents' assessment of my contributions. When I caught myself having strong reactions to books or movies or conversations with friends, I would automatically question whether these responses were worth sharing or whether they revealed some flaw in my character that was better kept hidden. I had learned to evaluate my own thoughts through the lens of whether they would create harmony or discord in family settings, and increasingly, the honest things I wanted to say fell into the discord category. School became my refuge because teachers seemed genuinely interested in what I thought about literature and history and mathematical problems. They would ask follow-up questions when I offered answers, and they appeared to value analytical thinking rather than seeing it as evidence of an argumentative nature. But even this validation felt temporary and artificial, like I was performing a version of myself that wouldn't be sustainable once I returned to the real world of family expectations. The systematic diminishing extended beyond conversations into every aspect of how I was allowed to exist within our household. My bedroom remained decorated with the same pale pink walls and generic floral bedding that my mother had chosen when I was 12, despite my repeated requests to update it to reflect my changing interests. When I asked if I could paint one wall a different color or hang some of my own artwork, the response was always that we needed to think about resale value and maintaining a cohesive look throughout the house. Meanwhile, Michael's room had been updated multiple times to accommodate his evolving interests, from childhood sports themes to teenage music posters to what was now essentially a young man's apartment complete with his own television and mini refrigerator. Jessica's room reflected her current personality with bright colors and decorations that changed seasonally according to her whims. But my space remained frozen in time, a reflection of who my parents thought I should be rather than who I was becoming. Even my achievements were subjected to this same diminishing process. When I made honor roll, the response was pleasure that I was finally applying myself properly rather than recognition of intellectual accomplishment. When I received recognition for my volunteer work at the church food bank, it was framed as evidence that I was learning appropriate feminine virtues of service, rather than acknowledgement of initiative or leadership skills. Everything I did well was interpreted as evidence that I was successfully conforming to expectations rather than evidence of individual talent or drive. Everything I struggled with was seen as proof that I needed more guidance and correction, rather than normal teenage development. The message was clear. My value lay in my ability to fulfill predetermined roles, rather than in anything I might uniquely contribute to our family or community. By my senior year of high school, I had become so accustomed to this systematic diminishing that I barely recognized it was happening anymore. It felt normal to have my ideas dismissed or redirected, normal to be treated as someone whose primary function was to avoid causing problems rather than to add anything positive to family life. I had learned to find my sense of self in the few hours each day when I wasn't home, in the temporary validation of academic success, and the friendship of people who seemed to enjoy my company without requiring extensive modifications to my personality. but the diminishing had accomplished its intended purpose. I had learned to question my own judgment, to defer to others' assessments of what I should want and how I should behave, and to see my natural inclinations toward independence and critical thinking as character flaws rather than strengths. The letter arrived on a Thursday in early March during my junior year of high school, addressed to Miss Sarah Torres in the kind of formal script that immediately suggested something important. I found it mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements on the kitchen counter, and something about the return address made my heart race before I even opened it. The Ohio State University Summer Business Institute had accepted my application for their competitive program for high school students interested in entrepreneurship and finance. I had submitted my application in secret 3 months earlier, using the school's computer lab during lunch periods to research requirements and draft essays, paying the application fee with money I had earned from babysitting Jessica and her friends on weekend evenings. As I read the acceptance letter, I felt something I had never experienced before. The certainty that someone outside my immediate family had evaluated my potential and found it worthy of investment. The program would provide college-level instruction in business fundamentals, networking opportunities with successful entrepreneurs, and most importantly, a pathway to scholarships and internships that could make my dreams of attending university financially realistic. I must have read the letter 4 times before the words fully penetrated. Not only had I been accepted, but I had been selected for partial scholarship support that would cover most of the program fees. All I needed was transportation to Columbus 3 days a week for 6 weeks during the summer, and permission from my parents to participate. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about sharing something with my family. This wasn't just another good grade or perfect attendance certificate that could be dismissed as expected behavior. This was recognition of potential that existed beyond the narrow boundaries of what was considered appropriate for Sarah Torres of Cedar Falls, Ohio. I waited until dinner that evening, when everyone was gathered around the table and the mood seemed relaxed. Michael was describing his plans for summer football training, and my parents were offering the kind of enthusiastic support and practical assistance that I had learned to expect for his pursuits. When there was a natural pause in the conversation, I took a deep breath and pulled the letter from my pocket. "I have some exciting news," I began, trying to keep my voice steady despite the way my hands were shaking slightly. "I applied for a summer program at Ohio State, and I got accepted. It's for students who want to study business and entrepreneurship, and they even offered me a partial scholarship." The silence that followed my announcement was so complete that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the sound of Mrs. Patterson's television through the thin walls that separated our house from the one next door. My father set down his fork with deliberate precision, and my mother's expression shifted from mild interest to something that looked almost like alarm. "You applied for something without discussing it with us first?" my father asked, his voice carrying the kind of measured calm that I had learned to recognize as more dangerous than shouting. "Sarah, we've talked about this. Major decisions affecting this family are made by the whole family, not by 17-year-old girls who think they know better than their parents." I had anticipated this response and prepared what I thought was a reasonable explanation. "I wanted to make sure I could actually get accepted before getting everyone's hopes up," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "I didn't want to waste your time with something that might not happen. But now that it's real, I thought we could talk about how to make it work." My mother had been studying the letter while my father spoke, and now she looked up with the kind of concerned expression she usually reserved for discussions about questionable influences or dangerous activities. "Sweetheart, this program is in Columbus. That's 2 hours away. How exactly did you imagine you would get there 3 days a week all summer?" The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to highlight the impracticality of my plan rather than to explore potential solutions. But I had actually thought through the logistics, spending hours researching bus schedules and calculating costs and considering alternatives. There's a Greyhound bus that leaves Cedar Falls at 6 in the morning and gets to Columbus by 8:15. I explained, pulling a folded schedule from my pocket as evidence of my planning. The program runs from 9 to 4, so I could take the 5:30 bus back and be home by 8. I've already figured out that I can afford the bus fare if I pick up extra babysitting jobs, and Amy's older sister said she might be able to give me rides some days because she works downtown. Instead of being impressed by my preparation, my parents seemed increasingly concerned by the evidence that I had been making detailed plans without consulting them. Michael was watching this exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents, while Jessica had stopped eating entirely and was looking back and forth between my parents and me like she was watching a tennis match. "Sarah," my father said, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, "I think you're missing the bigger picture here. This program might sound exciting, but what exactly do you think it's going to lead to? You're going to spend your entire summer riding buses and sitting in classrooms learning about business theory. And for what? So you can come home with a bunch of fancy ideas about starting your own company?" The dismissive tone in his voice made something twist in my stomach, but I pressed on, determined to make them understand why this opportunity mattered. "Dad, this isn't just about learning theory. The program includes internship placements and mentorship opportunities. Some of the graduates have started their own businesses or gotten full scholarships to top universities. This could really change my future." "Your future," my mother repeated, as if the concept itself was somehow presumptuous. "Honey, you're 17 years old. You don't need to be worried about changing your future right now. You need to be focused on finishing high school and helping your family and learning the kinds of skills that will actually serve you in the real world." What happened next was the moment when my dreams didn't just get discouraged or redirected, but systematically destroyed. My father took the acceptance letter from my mother's hands and read it thoroughly, his expression growing darker with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked directly at me with something that might have been disappointment or might have been anger. "Sarah, this program is designed for students who are planning to attend 4-year universities and pursue business degrees. Is that what you think you're going to do? Because if so, we need to have a very different conversation about realistic expectations and family responsibilities." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that this was the moment when I would either have to defend my ambitions or abandon them. Everything I had been quietly planning and hoping for was suddenly exposed and vulnerable, waiting for their approval or dismissal. "I don't know exactly what I want to study yet," I admitted. "But I know I want to go to college, and I know I'm interested in business and finance. This program could help me figure out what's possible and how to make it happen." My father was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to decide whether I was being deliberately defiant or simply naive. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than I had expected, which somehow made his words more devastating than shouting would have been. "Sarah, I think you've gotten some unrealistic ideas about what your life is going to look like after high school. College is expensive, and business programs are for students whose families can afford to support them while they spend 4 years learning things they could pick up much faster by working in the real world. You're a smart girl, but smart girls from families like ours don't become entrepreneurs. They become good employees, good wives, and good mothers." He folded the acceptance letter carefully and handed it back to me. "You can keep this as a reminder that you were smart enough to get accepted to something competitive. But we're not going to pretend that spending your summer chasing fantasies is more important than helping your family and preparing for realistic adult responsibilities." The dream assassination was complete, efficient, and presented as loving guidance rather than crushing limitation. My parents had managed to transform what felt like the greatest opportunity of my life into evidence of my own poor judgment and unrealistic expectations. They had taken my excitement and enthusiasm and reframed them as problems that needed to be corrected, rather than potential that deserved to be cultivated. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket, nodding as if I understood and agreed with their wisdom, because arguing would only make the situation worse. But something fundamental had shifted during that dinner conversation. For the first time, I truly understood that my parents and I had completely different visions of who I was and what I should become, and that their version of my future felt like a kind of death. After the business program letter was dismissed and filed away like a dangerous document that could no longer be allowed to influence family decisions, I learned that survival sometimes requires building a second life that exists parallel to the one everyone else can see. The morning after that devastating dinner conversation, I woke up with a clarity that felt almost like relief. If my parents couldn't support my ambitions, then I would have to support them myself, quietly and carefully, until I was old enough to make my own choices without asking permission. The first step was financial independence, which meant expanding beyond the occasional babysitting job into something more systematic and reliable. I had been watching Jessica and her friends for months on weekends, earning $20 here and $30 there, but that kind of sporadic income wouldn't support any real plans. What I needed was steady work that my parents would approve of, or better yet, work they wouldn't even notice. Mrs. Kowalski, who lived 3 houses down from us on Maple Street, had been struggling to maintain her garden since her husband died the previous fall. She was in her 70s, proud and reluctant to ask for help. But I had observed her spending increasingly long periods resting on her front porch between bouts of weeding and watering. When I approached her one afternoon in late March, I framed my offer as a favor rather than employment. "Mrs. Kowalski, I'm trying to get more exercise, and I was wondering if you'd mind if I helped with your garden work a few afternoons a week. I know you like to keep everything perfect, and I promise I'll follow your instructions exactly." The request was designed to appeal to her need for control, while providing me with work that would look like community service, rather than employment to anyone watching from our house. She agreed to let me help twice a week for what she called a small appreciation payment of $15 per session. Within a month, her garden was looking better than it had in years, and she had started recommending me to other elderly neighbors who needed assistance with yard work, but were uncomfortable with hiring professional landscapers they didn't know personally. By May of my junior year, I was earning roughly $60 a week from what appeared to be volunteer work helping senior citizens in our neighborhood. My parents viewed this activity with approval, seeing it as evidence that I was developing appropriate feminine virtues of service and community engagement. What they didn't realize was that I was also learning valuable lessons about customer service, time management, and the kind of relationship-building skills that no business program could have taught me. Mrs. Kowalski became my first real mentor, though neither of us would have used that term at the time. She had worked as a bookkeeper for her husband's small manufacturing business for 30 years before retiring, and she understood numbers and organization in ways that made my school mathematics classes seem almost elementary. While we worked, in her garden, she would tell stories about managing payroll and inventory and customer accounts, sharing practical knowledge about business operations that felt more valuable than anything I was learning in traditional academic settings. "The secret to any successful business," she told me one afternoon while we were planting tomatoes, "is understanding that every transaction is really about relationships. People don't just buy products or services, they buy trust, reliability, and the confidence that someone will take care of them the way they want to be taken care of." These conversations were the closest thing I had to the business education my parents had prevented me from pursuing, and I absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone who understood that this might be my only chance to learn these things. Mrs. Kowalski seemed to recognize my hunger for knowledge and began deliberately incorporating more business discussions into our gardening sessions. The second part of my secret rebellion involved what I privately called intelligence gathering. Since I couldn't openly research college programs or career opportunities on our family computer without raising questions, I had to find other ways to access the information I needed. The Cedar Falls Public Library became my second home, where I would spend every free period and several hours after school each week, supposedly working on homework, but actually researching universities, scholarship programs, and career paths that might be available to someone with my academic record and financial limitations. I learned to clear browser histories and use private browsing modes and access information in ways that left no digital trail connecting back to my family's computer or accounts. I created a secret email address using a computer at the library and used it to request information from colleges and programs that interested me. I researched bus schedules and apartment rentals and job opportunities in cities where I might want to live after graduating high school. Most importantly, I began to understand the specific requirements and timelines for things like college applications, financial aid, and scholarship competitions. I realized that my parents' dismissal of higher education wasn't just about their philosophical beliefs, but also about their complete lack of knowledge about how these systems actually worked. They had never navigated college admissions themselves, and they seemed to assume that the process was more complicated and expensive than someone from our background could realistically manage. But my research revealed that there were actually multiple pathways to higher education that could work for students without significant family financial support. Community college could provide an affordable foundation for transferring to four-year programs. Merit-based scholarships were available for students with strong academic records, regardless of family income. Work-study programs and student loans could make up the difference between what scholarships covered and what education actually cost. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that my parents' limitations were being presented as universal truths rather than personal choices. They weren't wrong that college was expensive and challenging, but they were wrong that it was impossible for someone like me to achieve. The third component of my secret rebellion was what I called future planning, which involved making concrete preparations for the life I intended to build once I turned 18 and gained the legal right to make my own decisions. I opened a savings account at a bank in the next town over, using my babysitting and gardening income to build a fund that could support me during the transition between living at home and achieving financial independence. I researched the legal requirements for things like signing apartment leases and enrolling in college programs without parental support. I learned about emancipation procedures and financial aid applications and the kinds of documentation I would need to prove my independence from my family's financial resources. Most crucially, I began developing relationships with adults outside my family who could serve as references, mentors, or sources of support when I eventually made my move toward independence. Mrs. Kowalski was the most important of these relationships. But I also cultivated connections with teachers, librarians, and other community members who seemed to recognize and value my potential in ways my parents didn't. My English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had been encouraging me to consider applying for competitive scholarship programs since my sophomore year. When I explained that my parents weren't supportive of higher education plans, she offered to help me navigate applications and requirements during lunch periods and after school. She couldn't provide financial support, but she could provide knowledge and advocacy that would prove invaluable when application deadlines approached. The reference librarian, Mr. Chen, had noticed my frequent research sessions and eventually asked if I was working on a particularly complex school project. When I explained my situation in general terms, he began setting aside relevant resources and alerting me to new programs or opportunities that matched my interests. He taught me advanced research techniques and helped me understand how to evaluate sources and information in ways that would serve me throughout my academic and professional life. By the end of my junior year, I had constructed an entirely parallel existence that my parents knew nothing about. On the surface, I was the compliant daughter who had accepted their guidance about realistic expectations and appropriate behavior. But underneath, I was systematically preparing for a future that would be entirely of my own creation, funded by my own efforts, and directed toward goals they had never imagined I might be capable of achieving. the secret rebellion wasn't just about accumulating money or information or supportive relationships, though all of those elements were crucial. It was about proving to myself that I had the intelligence, determination, and resourcefulness necessary to succeed independently. Every dollar I earned and saved was evidence that I could support myself. Every piece of information I gathered was proof that I could navigate complex systems without guidance from people who had already decided what I should want. Most importantly, every small success in my parallel life was confirmation that my parents' assessment of my potential might be wrong, that the dreams they had dismissed as unrealistic might actually be achievable for someone willing to work hard enough and smart enough to make them happen. The beautiful lie of our family had taught me that appearances could be maintained even when reality was completely different. Now I was applying that lesson in reverse, maintaining the appearance of acceptance and compliance while building a reality that would eventually make their approval irrelevant. The explosion came on a Tuesday evening in early June, just 3 weeks before my high school graduation, when the carefully constructed balance between my secret preparations and my family's expectations finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. I had been so focused on maintaining the illusion of compliance while building my independent future that I failed to notice how my increased confidence and competence had begun to threaten the family dynamics that depended on my diminished role. The trigger was something that should have been cause for celebration. I had been selected as the recipient of the Henderson Memorial Scholarship, a full tuition award given annually to one graduating senior from Cedar Falls High School who demonstrated academic excellence and community service. The scholarship would cover 4 years at any state university in Ohio, and the selection committee had specifically noted my volunteer work with elderly residents and my outstanding performance in mathematics and business courses. When Mrs. Patterson from the guidance office called our house to share the news, she spoke with my mother, assuming that parents would naturally be the first to know about such significant recognition. My mother accepted the congratulations with what I'm sure sounded like appropriate gratitude and pride. But when I arrived home from my after-school job at Pine Grove Diner, I found both parents waiting for me at the kitchen table with expressions that suggested I was about to be interrogated rather than celebrated. "Sarah, we need to talk," my father began, his voice carrying that particular tone of disappointed authority that I had learned to dread. "Mrs. Patterson called today with some very interesting news about a scholarship you apparently received. She seemed to think we already knew about this, which suggests you've been having conversations about your future that didn't include your parents." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I realized that my months of careful preparation had led to a moment I hadn't adequately planned for. The moment when my secret ambitions would be exposed not through my own choice to reveal them, but through external recognition that I couldn't control or hide. "I didn't know I was going to win," I said, trying to sound apologetic rather than defensive. "I submitted the application because my math teacher said I should, but I never expected anything to come of it. I was going to tell you if I actually got it, but I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up over something that probably wouldn't happen." My mother was holding a piece of paper that I recognized as information about the scholarship program, which she had apparently requested from the school after Mrs. Patterson's call. "Sarah, this scholarship is specifically for students planning to attend 4-year universities. The application required essays about your career goals and academic plans. You couldn't have completed this application without having very specific ideas about your future, ideas that you've apparently been developing without consulting your family." The evidence of my deception was undeniable, and I realized that this was the moment when I would either have to abandon my carefully constructed plans or defend them openly, knowing that doing so would fundamentally alter my relationship with my parents in ways that couldn't be undone. "I want to go to college," I said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating to speak aloud. "I know you don't think it's realistic, but I've been researching, and I think I can make it work. This scholarship changes everything. It means I can get an education without it costing you anything." My father leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, studying me with an expression that suggested he was seeing me clearly for the first time and didn't like what he was discovering. "Sarah, do you understand what you're saying? You're telling us that for months, maybe years, you've been planning a future that has nothing to do with your family's needs or expectations. You've been lying to us about your intentions and your activities." The word lying stung because it was accurate, even though my deception had been motivated by survival rather than malice. I had been lying about my research, my savings, my relationships with mentors, and my fundamental beliefs about what my life should look like after high school. But I had been lying because telling the truth would have resulted in exactly the kind of confrontation we were having now. And I hadn't been ready for that confrontation until I had alternatives in place. "I wasn't lying about anything important," I protested, knowing even as I said it that this distinction wouldn't matter to parents who viewed any form of independent planning as betrayal. I was just trying to be responsible and make sure I had options before discussing them with you. "Options?" my mother repeated, her voice rising with something that sounded like panic. "Sarah, you're 18 years old. You don't get to decide unilaterally that you're going to spend the next 4 years of your life pursuing some fantasy about becoming a businesswoman or whatever it is you think this scholarship is going to lead to." What happened next was the moment when years of accumulated resentment and frustration finally broke through the careful restraint I had maintained throughout high school. Something about the way she said fantasy, with the same dismissive tone my father had used when discussing the summer business program, triggered a response that I hadn't known I was capable of. "It's not a fantasy," I said, standing up from the kitchen table with enough force that my chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. "I'm good at mathematics and organization and working with people. I've been earning my own money and managing my own schedule and helping your neighbors with their problems for over a year. I'm not some irresponsible teenager who doesn't understand how the world works. I'm someone who's been preparing for independence while you've been treating me like I'm incapable of making reasonable decisions about my own future." The silence that followed my outburst was unlike anything I had ever experienced in our house. My parents stared at me as if I had transformed into a stranger before their eyes, and I realized that in some fundamental way, I had. The compliant, diminished version of Sarah Torres, who had learned to absorb criticism and defer to others' judgment, had been replaced by someone who was willing to fight for her own dreams and defend her own worth. My father was the first to recover from the shock of seeing me assert myself so directly. When he spoke, his voice was colder than I had ever heard it, carrying a finality that made my stomach clench with recognition of what was about to happen. "Sarah, I think you've forgotten who you're talking to and where you're living. This is our house, and you are our daughter, and you will not speak to your mother and me with that kind of disrespect. If you want to live under our roof, you will follow our rules and accept our guidance about what's best for your future." The ultimatum was clear, and I understood that this was the moment when I would either have to submit completely to their vision of my life or choose independence with all of its risks and uncertainties. Everything I had been secretly preparing for over the past year had led to this decision point, and I discovered that I was more ready for it than I had expected. "What if I don't want to live under your roof anymore?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "What if I think I'm ready to make my own decisions about my future?" My mother made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob, but my father's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed almost relieved that the conflict had finally reached a point where clear lines could be drawn and consequences could be established. "Then you're welcome to try," he said, standing up from the table with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he had been preparing for this conversation longer than I had realized. "But if you walk out that door thinking you know better, then the people who raised you and provided for you for 18 years, then you walk out on your own. No money, no support, no running back home when reality hits, and you discover that the world doesn't care about your potential as much as you think it does." The challenge was issued with such calm certainty that I almost lost my nerve. This wasn't the explosive argument I had been bracing for, but something more calculated and devastating. A test of whether my secret preparations had actually equipped me for the independence I claimed to want. I looked around the kitchen where I had spent countless hours doing homework and helping with dinner preparations and listening to family conversations that rarely included my voice or perspective. I thought about my bedroom upstairs with its outdated decorations and the collection of books and papers I had accumulated in preparation for a future my parents couldn't imagine. I thought about my savings account in the next town over and the relationships I had built with people who seemed to believe in my potential. Most importantly, I thought about the scholarship letter that was still sitting on the kitchen table, representing an opportunity that would disappear if I didn't claim it, and the person I would become if I stayed versus the person I might become if I left. "Okay," I said quietly, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff into empty space. "I'll pack my things." My father nodded, as if this outcome had been inevitable from the moment Mrs. Patterson made her congratulatory phone call. "You have until tomorrow morning," he said. "After that, you'll need to figure out your own living arrangements." As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear my mother crying in the kitchen and my father's voice trying to comfort her, explaining that sometimes tough love was the only way to teach stubborn children about the consequences of their choices. But I was no longer listening to their interpretation of what was happening between us. For the first time in my life, I was focused entirely on my own understanding of the situation and my own plans for what came next. The breaking point had arrived exactly as I had always known it would. Not as a sudden catastrophe, but as the inevitable result of two incompatible visions of my future finally colliding with enough force to make coexistence impossible. The first night of independence arrived with a clarity that felt almost surreal, like waking up from a long dream to discover that the world had different rules than you had always assumed. I packed everything that mattered into 2 duffel bags and a backpack, leaving behind the bedroom furniture and decorations that had never really felt like mine anyway. The most difficult decision was choosing which books to take and which to abandon, knowing that I might not have space for luxuries like literature in whatever living situation I managed to arrange. By 6 o'clock Wednesday morning, I was standing on the front porch of 847 Maple Street, with my belongings at my feet and my parents watching from the kitchen window. My father had insisted on this formal departure, as if witnessing my exit would somehow prove the point he had been trying to make about the consequences of ingratitude and poor judgment. My mother had wanted to pack me sandwiches and slip me $20, but he had prevented both gestures, explaining that helping me would undermine the lesson I needed to learn about self-reliance. Jessica had tried to say goodbye, but I had asked her not to come downstairs, knowing that watching her younger sister walk away would be more painful for both of us than the clean break I was attempting to manage. Michael had left early for summer football practice, avoiding the entire scene with the kind of strategic absence that had always characterized his approach to family conflict. The walk from Maple Street to downtown Cedar Falls took 15 minutes, and I used that time to mentally review the plans I had been developing over the past year. My savings account contained $843, which represented every bit of income I had earned from babysitting and gardening work that hadn't been spent on application fees or transportation to the library. It was enough to cover a security deposit and first month's rent on a very modest apartment, assuming I could find someone willing to rent to an 18-year-old with no credit history or references beyond elderly neighbors who knew me as a reliable gardener. My first stop was Pine Grove Diner, where I had been working part-time for the past 8 months. Frank Kowalski, the owner and Mrs. Kowalski's nephew, had always treated me fairly and seemed to appreciate my reliability and customer service skills. When I explained my situation in general terms, asking if there might be opportunities for additional hours or responsibilities, he offered something I hadn't expected: a full-time position with a small raise and the possibility of learning. basic restaurant management skills. Sarah, you're one of the few employees I have who actually understands that this business depends on making customers feel welcome and taken care of, Frank said, as we sat in the empty diner before the breakfast rush began. If you're serious about wanting more hours, I can offer you 40 hours a week at $8 an hour, plus tips. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady. And you'll learn more about running a small business than most people figure out in years of college. The job offer solved the most immediate problem of supporting myself, but it also forced me to confront the reality of what independence would actually look like. 40 hours a week at Pine Grove Diner would provide enough income to cover basic living expenses, but it would also consume most of my time and energy, leaving little opportunity for the college education I had been planning to pursue with my scholarship. The scholarship required full-time enrollment, which was incompatible with full-time employment, and deferring the award for a year wasn't permitted under the program guidelines. For the first time, I began to understand the impossible mathematics that had influenced my parents' skepticism about higher education. The gap between what education cost and what someone from our economic background could realistically afford was wider than I had realized, even with significant scholarship support. But Frank's offer also included something I hadn't anticipated: practical education that could be valuable regardless of whether I ever made it to a traditional college classroom. Learning restaurant management would teach me about inventory, control, customer service, employee supervision, and profit margins. Understanding how a small business operated successfully could provide skills that would be transferable to other industries and opportunities. I'd like to accept the position, I told Frank, shaking hands on an agreement that represented both a solution to my immediate needs and a significant departure from the academic path I had been planning. When can I start full-time hours? Tomorrow, he said, smiling in a way that suggested he had been hoping I would make this choice. We open at 6, so if you can be here by 5:30, I'll show you how we handle the breakfast prep and morning setup. My second stop was the Cedar Falls Housing Authority, where I hoped to find information about affordable rental options for someone with limited income and no rental history. The waiting room was filled with people who looked like they were dealing with various forms of housing instability, and I realized that my situation, while frightening to me, was probably less desperate than many of the circumstances that brought people to seek assistance. The housing counselor, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Garcia, listened to my explanation with the kind of professional sympathy that suggested she had heard similar stories many times before. When I described my employment situation and available resources, she nodded thoughtfully and pulled out a folder of listings for what she called transitional housing options. There's a room available in a house that we manage for young adults who are transitioning to independence, she explained, showing me a basic information sheet. It's not luxurious, but it's clean and safe, and the rent is $350 a month, utilities included. You'd be sharing the house with 3 other residents, all people in their early 20s who are working and trying to get established. The housing option was more affordable than I had dared to hope, and the idea of living with other people who were facing similar challenges felt less isolating than trying to manage complete independence immediately. When Mrs. Garcia offered to arrange a viewing of the room that afternoon, I accepted eagerly, feeling like the practical pieces of my new life might actually fit together. The house at 412 Oak Street was a converted Victorian that had clearly seen better days, but it was structurally sound and reasonably maintained. My room was small, with space for a single bed, a desk, and a narrow closet, but it had a window that faced east toward downtown and let in morning sunlight that made the space feel hopeful rather than cramped. My housemates were Maria, a 22-year-old, who worked at the hospital and was saving money to attend nursing school. David, a 20-year-old who had aged out of foster care and was working construction while studying for his GED. And Jennifer, a 19-year-old who had left an abusive family situation and was working 2 part-time jobs while trying to finish high school online. Meeting them made me realize that my situation, while difficult, was not unique or insurmountable. Each of them had faced the challenge of building adult lives without traditional family support, and each had found ways to survive and work toward their goals despite significant obstacles. Their experiences offered both cautionary tales about the difficulties I would face and inspiring examples of resilience and resourcefulness. "The first few months are the hardest," Maria told me as we sat on the front porch that evening, sharing a pizza that Jennifer had brought home from her job at Tony's Italian Kitchen. "Everything costs more than you expect, and you're constantly worried about money and whether you're making the right decisions. But after a while, you start to realize that you're actually capable of taking care of yourself, and that feeling is worth all the stress and uncertainty." David nodded in agreement, adding, "The weirdest part for me was discovering that I was actually better at managing my own life than the adults who had been making decisions for me. All those years of being told I wasn't ready for responsibility. And it turned out I was more responsible than most of the people who were supposed to be taking care of me." Their perspectives helped me understand that the free fall I was experiencing wasn't just about losing the security of family support, but also about discovering capabilities and strengths that had been hidden or dismissed in my previous living situation. The fear and uncertainty I felt were real and legitimate, but they coexisted with a growing sense of excitement about the possibility of creating a life that was entirely my own design. That first night in my new room, lying on a borrowed mattress, with my few belongings arranged around me like anchors in unfamiliar territory, I felt simultaneously more vulnerable and more powerful than I had ever felt before. The safety net of family support was gone, replaced by the more precarious but also more authentic foundation of my own judgment and abilities. The free fall had landed me in a place that was harder than I had expected, but also more manageable than my parents had predicted. I wasn't on my knees begging for forgiveness or discovering that the world was too difficult for someone like me to navigate independently. Instead, I was learning that independence was both more challenging and more achievable than anyone had prepared me to understand. The rhythm of full-time work established itself within the first week, creating a structure that felt both exhausting and reassuring after the uncertainty of that initial leap into independence. 5:30 in the morning became my new normal. Arriving at Pine Grove Diner, while Cedar Falls was still sleeping to help Frank prepare for the breakfast crowd that would begin arriving by 6:15. The work was physical and fast-paced, requiring the kind of multitasking and customer service, skills that I had been developing during my part-time employment, but hadn't fully appreciated until they became the foundation of my survival. Frank proved to be the kind of employer who understood that investing in employee development was good business strategy. Rather than simply assigning me to repetitive tasks, he began teaching me the broader aspects of restaurant operations, explaining how food costs affected menu pricing, how scheduling decisions impacted labor expenses, and how customer satisfaction translated into repeat business and positive word-of-mouth advertising. "Sarah, you're picking this up faster than most people who have been in the industry for years," he told me during a brief lull between the breakfast and lunch rushes. "You understand that every detail matters, from how quickly we get orders to the table to how clean we keep the bathrooms. Most employees see this as just a job, but you're seeing it as a system that only works when all the pieces fit together, properly." His recognition felt different from the academic validation I had received in high school, more grounded in practical results and immediate consequences. When I suggested reorganizing the prep area to reduce the time servers spent waiting for orders, and the change actually improved our service speed, I could see the direct impact of my contribution in ways that classroom achievements had never provided. The financial reality of independence also became clear within those first few weeks. After rent, utilities, groceries, and transportation costs, my income from the diner left very little margin for unexpected expenses or long-term savings. I was covering my basic needs, but barely, and any significant surprise, from medical bills to car repairs, would have created a crisis that could have undermined the entire careful balance I was maintaining. But I was also learning lessons about resource management, and creative problem solving that no amount of theoretical education could have provided. When I needed professional clothes for work but couldn't afford new ones, Mrs. Kowalski invited me to go through her deceased husband's closet, finding button-down shirts that could be altered to fit me properly. When my housemate David mentioned that he was struggling with basic math concepts while studying for his GED, I offered tutoring sessions in exchange for help with car maintenance, creating the kind of mutual support system that made limited resources stretch further. The most surprising discovery was how much I enjoyed the problem-solving aspects of restaurant work and household management. Every day presented challenges that required quick thinking and practical solutions. How to handle difficult customers without losing their business, how to reorganize inventory systems to reduce waste, how to coordinate schedules and responsibilities among housemates who all worked different hours and had different personal habits. These weren't the kinds of problems that had clear right answers or could be solved by referring to textbooks or established procedures. They required the kind of judgment and adaptability that I had been developing through years of navigating family dynamics and managing multiple responsibilities, skills that I was finally able to apply in an environment where they were valued, rather than dismissed. 3 months after leaving home, I received my first real validation that the path I had chosen might lead somewhere beyond mere survival. Frank approached me during a typically busy Saturday lunch rush with a proposal that I hadn't seen coming. "Sarah, I've been thinking about expanding our catering services, but I need someone who can handle the organizational side of that business. Someone who understands food service, but also has the communication skills to work directly with clients and coordinate events." He paused to refill coffee for a table of regulars before continuing. It would mean additional responsibilities and irregular hours, but also additional income and experience that could be valuable if you ever want to start your own business. The catering opportunity represented exactly the kind of practical business education I had been hoping to pursue through traditional academic channels. Managing catering events would require skills in project management, customer relations, financial planning, and logistical coordination. It would also provide exposure to local business networks and potential mentorship relationships that could open doors to future opportunities. "I'm definitely interested," I told Frank, trying to contain my excitement while maintaining the professional demeanor that had earned his respect. "What kind of timeline are you thinking about for getting this started?" "I'd like to begin with small events, maybe office meetings and family gatherings, and see how the demand develops," he explained. "If you're willing to take on the additional responsibility, we could start advertising catering services next month and see what kind of response we get." The conversation represented a turning point in how I understood my situation. I wasn't just surviving independently or proving that I could manage basic adult responsibilities. I was actually building skills and relationships that could support the kind of professional development I had always wanted to pursue. The path looked different from what I had originally envisioned, but it was leading towards similar goals of business knowledge and financial independence. That evening, I called Mrs. Kowalski to share the news about the catering opportunity, knowing that she would understand both the practical significance and the personal validation that Frank's offer represented. She had continued to serve as an informal mentor, offering advice about everything from professional behavior to personal financial management, and her perspective had become increasingly valuable as I navigated the challenges of early adulthood. "Sarah, this is exactly the kind of opportunity that successful people learn to recognize and seize," she told me, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had watched a risky investment begin to pay dividends. "You're not just learning how to run someone else's business. You're learning how to identify opportunities and develop the skills that will allow you to create your own opportunities eventually." Her words helped me recognize something that I had been too focused on day-to-day survival to fully appreciate. The foundation I was building through practical work experience was actually more comprehensive and immediately applicable than the theoretical education I had originally planned to pursue. I was learning about customer service, financial management, staff coordination, marketing, and strategic planning through direct application rather than classroom discussion. The realization didn't diminish my respect for formal education or eliminate my desire to eventually pursue higher learning opportunities. But it did help me understand that there were multiple pathways to professional development and business knowledge, and that the path I had been forced to take might actually provide advantages that traditional academic routes couldn't offer. 6 months after leaving home, I had established what felt like a sustainable foundation for independent adult life. I was earning enough income to cover my expenses with a small surplus for emergencies and savings. I was developing professional skills and relationships that had clear potential for future growth. I was living in a supportive environment with people who shared similar goals and challenges. Most importantly, I was discovering aspects of my own personality and capabilities that had been suppressed or dismissed in my family environment. The confidence I felt when successfully managing complex catering logistics or resolving customer service problems was different from academic achievement, more grounded in practical results and immediate feedback from real-world consequences. The first foothold had been secured through a combination of preparation, opportunity, and determination. But it had also been secured through the recognition that success could take many different forms, and that the version of success I was building for myself might actually be more satisfying and sustainable than the conventional path my parents had rejected on my behalf. The second year of independence established the kind of relentless routine that transforms emergency survival strategies into sustainable life patterns. By 7 o'clock each morning, I was moving through the familiar choreography of breakfast service at Pine Grove Diner, anticipating customer needs and coordinating with kitchen staff with the kind of efficiency that comes from performing the same essential tasks hundreds of times until they become instinctive rather than effortful. The catering side of our business had grown steadily through word-of-mouth recommendations and Frank's strategic networking with local business associations. What had started as occasional office lunch orders had expanded into regular contracts. With 3 small companies, monthly catering for the Cedar Falls Rotary Club, and a growing number of private events, including anniversary parties, graduation celebrations, and small wedding receptions. Managing these catering contracts required skills that I had never expected to develop when I first accepted Frank's offer of full-time employment. I was learning to coordinate with multiple vendors, negotiate pricing for bulk food purchases, manage staff schedules that varied based on event requirements, and maintain customer relationships that often extended beyond individual transactions into ongoing business partnerships. The most challenging aspect was also the most rewarding. Every catering event was essentially a small business project that required planning, execution, and follow-up evaluation. When the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce hired us to cater their annual awards dinner for 60 people, I spent weeks coordinating menu selection, rental equipment, staffing schedules, and setup logistics. The successful execution of that event led to 3 additional bookings from attendees who had been impressed with our service quality and professionalism. But the grinding ascent wasn't just about expanding business responsibilities and developing professional skills. It was also about the daily discipline required to maintain independence while building toward larger goals that still felt distant and uncertain. Every morning, I woke up knowing that the choices I made that day would either move me closer to long-term stability and success, or create problems that could undermine the foundation I had been working to establish. The financial mathematics remained tight enough that there was no room for significant mistakes or unexpected expenses. When my car needed brake repairs that cost $300, I had to work extra shifts for 2 weeks to rebuild the emergency fund that the repair had depleted. When I caught a respiratory infection that kept me out of work for 4 days, the lost income meant postponing plans to replace my rapidly deteriorating work shoes for another month. These kinds of financial pressures created a constant background, stress that was both exhausting and motivating. I couldn't afford to be careless with money or casual about work responsibilities because the consequences of poor judgment would be immediate and potentially devastating. But the same pressure also forced me to develop resource management skills and strategic thinking abilities that many people never acquire because they never face situations where such skills are essential for survival. Living with housemates who were facing similar challenges provided both support and perspective that helped normalize the grinding nature of building independence from limited resources. Maria had finally saved enough money to begin nursing school, but she was working 30 hours a week while maintaining a full course load, surviving on 4 hours of sleep most nights, and a diet that consisted primarily of pasta and whatever. Vegetables were marked down for quick sale at the grocery store. David had passed his GED exam and was taking community college courses in construction management while working full-time for a local contractor, planning to eventually start his own business specializing in historic home renovation. Jennifer had completed her high school diploma online and was working as a supervisor at Tony's Italian Kitchen while saving money to attend culinary school. Watching my housemates pursue their goals while managing the same kinds of financial and logistical constraints that I faced daily helped me understand that the grinding ascent was a normal part of building adult lives without family financial support. The exhaustion and stress weren't signs that I was failing or that independence had been a mistake, but rather evidence that I was doing the difficult work required to create long-term stability and opportunity. The most significant development during this period was my growing recognition that the practical business education I was receiving through restaurant work might actually be more valuable than the formal academic preparation I had originally planned to pursue. Frank had begun involving me in broader business decisions, from reviewing quarterly financial reports to developing marketing strategies for expanding our customer base. "Sarah, you understand profit margins and customer retention better than people who have business degrees," he told me during one of our monthly planning meetings. "You've learned these concepts through direct application, which means you understand not just what works in theory, but what actually works in practice with real customers and real financial constraints." His assessment encouraged me to begin thinking about longer-term career possibilities that built on the skills and experience I was developing, rather than requiring me to start over in a completely different field. The idea of eventually opening my own restaurant or catering business no longer seemed like an impossible fantasy, but rather like a logical extension of the knowledge and relationships I was accumulating through daily work. But the grinding ascent also included systematic preparation for opportunities that might develop in the future. I had begun taking evening business courses at Cedar Falls Community College, using the employee tuition assistance program that Frank had arranged with the local college to help his staff develop additional skills. The courses in accounting, marketing, and small business management provided theoretical frameworks for understanding concepts that I was learning through practical application. The combination of hands-on experience and formal coursework created a kind of comprehensive business education that neither approach could have provided independently. When my accounting professor discussed cash flow management, I could relate the concepts to the daily reality of managing restaurant operations and catering event budgets. When my marketing professor talked about customer relationship building, I could draw on examples from interactions with regular diner customers and catering clients. 2 years after leaving home, I had progressed from desperate survival mode to what felt like sustainable forward momentum. My income had increased through raises and additional catering responsibilities to the point where I could cover expenses comfortably and maintain a modest but growing savings account. I had developed professional skills and relationships that were clearly valuable in the local business community. I had completed enough college coursework to understand that higher education remained a viable option if I chose to pursue it more systematically in the future. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that the independence I had chosen was not just sustainable, but actually preferable to the limited options that had been available within my family environment. The person I was becoming through the grinding ascent felt more authentic and capable than the diminished version of myself that had learned to seek approval and avoid conflict, rather than pursuing her own goals and defending her own judgment. The grinding ascent hadn't been glamorous or easy, but it had been effective in ways that I was only beginning to fully appreciate. Every skill I had developed, every relationship I had built, and every challenge I had successfully navigated had contributed to a foundation of competence and confidence that felt increasingly solid and sustainable. The girl who had been thrown out for being good for nothing had spent 2 years proving that she was actually quite good at many things that mattered in the practical world of adult responsibilities and business operations. The grinding ascent was preparing her for opportunities that hadn't existed when she first walked away from 847 Maple Street, carrying everything she owned and hoping that independence might be possible for someone willing to work hard enough to achieve it. The moment of choice arrived not with fanfare or dramatic revelation, but during an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in November when I was reviewing quarterly financial reports for our expanded catering business and noticed something that made me pause. 3 years had passed since I left Cedar Falls for my new life in Columbus, and somewhere in the methodical progression of building financial stability and professional competence, I had begun to forget that my independence had been a conscious decision rather than an inevitable outcome. The reminder came in the form of a wedding invitation that arrived at my German Village townhouse, forwarded from my old address at the Oak Street Transitional Housing. Jessica Torres was getting married to her longtime boyfriend, Mark, and someone in my family had apparently decided that enough time had passed for reconciliation attempts to begin. The invitation was addressed to Sarah Torres, suggesting that they either didn't know I had dropped the family name professionally or were choosing to ignore that detail. Inside the formal cardstock and elegant calligraphy was a handwritten note from Jessica that made my chest tighten with recognition of the emotional complexity I had been successfully avoiding for 3 years. Sarah, I know things have been complicated, but I really want you to be there for the most important day of my life. I miss you so much, and I think Mom and Dad are finally ready to admit they made mistakes. Please consider coming home, even if it's just for 1 day. Love, Jess. The invitation forced me to confront questions I had been postponing through the simple expedient of staying too busy to examine them closely. Did I miss my family? Yes, desperately. Especially Jessica, and the version of Michael who had existed before family dynamics had turned us into competitors rather than siblings. Did I regret the choices that had led to our estrangement? The answer was more complicated than a simple yes or no. I regretted the pain that my departure had caused. Jessica, who had never asked to be caught in the middle of conflicts she hadn't created. I regretted the loss of connection with Michael, who had probably been as trapped by family expectations as I had been, just in different ways. I even regretted the way things had ended with my parents, not because I believed I had been wrong to leave, but because I wished the situation had never reached a point where leaving felt like the only viable option. But I didn't regret building a life that belonged entirely to me, where my ideas were valued and my contributions were recognized, and my success was measured by my own standards rather than other people's limitations. I didn't regret discovering that I was capable of much more than anyone in my family had imagined, including myself. Most importantly, I didn't regret learning that love and loyalty could coexist with boundaries and self-respect. The wedding. Invitation had arrived at a moment when those lessons were particularly relevant because of developments in my professional life that were forcing me to make choices about the kind of future I wanted to build. Torres Financial Solutions had grown beyond my most optimistic projections, expanding from basic bookkeeping services for small businesses into comprehensive financial consulting that included tax preparation, business planning, and investment guidance. My client roster now included 37 regular accounts, ranging from independent contractors and small retail businesses to professional service firms and growing restaurants. I had hired 2 part-time assistants and was considering opening a second office location to accommodate clients in neighboring communities who had been requesting my services based on referrals from existing customers. The success felt both satisfying and overwhelming because it represented possibilities I had never allowed myself to seriously consider when I was focused entirely on survival and basic independence. I could continue expanding the business until it became a significant regional presence in financial services. I could maintain the current size and focus on providing exceptional service to a manageable client base. I could even sell the business eventually and use the proceeds to pursue other opportunities, including the university education I had postponed but never entirely abandoned. But success also created new pressures and responsibilities that required the same kind of careful decision-making that had guided my transition from family dependence to independence. Every choice about business expansion or client relationships or professional development had consequences that would affect not just my own future, but also the livelihoods of employees who depended on my judgment and the financial stability of clients who trusted my expertise. The wedding invitation represented a different kind of choice, one that would determine whether the independence I had built would be used to maintain permanent separation from my family or to engage with them from a position of strength and self-determination. For 3 years, distance had provided protection from the dynamics that had made living at home feel impossible. But distance had also prevented any opportunity for relationships to evolve or for family members to recognize the person I had become rather than the person they remembered. I spent weeks considering how to respond to Jessica's invitation, weighing the potential benefits of reconnection against the risks of reopening conflicts that had been resolved through separation, rather than genuine resolution. The decision became more complicated when Amy Rodriguez called to provide context that hadn't been included in Jessica's hopeful note. "Sarah, I think you should know what's been happening with your family before you decide whether to come back for the wedding," Amy said during our monthly phone conversation, her voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she was trying to report facts without influencing my decisions. "Your parents have been having some serious financial problems. Your dad's construction business has been struggling for the past 2 years, and they've fallen behind on property taxes and some other bills." The information shouldn't have surprised me, given the economic challenges that had been affecting small businesses throughout Ohio, but it created a new dimension to my decision-making process. If my parents were facing financial difficulties, my presence at Jessica's wedding might be interpreted as an opportunity to request assistance rather than a genuine desire for reconciliation. "How serious are the problems?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew the answer based on Amy's reluctance to provide details without being asked directly. "Serious enough that there's been talk around town about them potentially losing the house," Amy replied carefully. "I don't know all the specifics, but I heard from someone at the bank that they're significantly behind on property taxes, and you know how that can escalate quickly once the county gets involved." The conversation with Amy forced me to acknowledge something I had been avoiding since receiving Jessica's invitation. My financial success had created not just independence from my family, but also the possibility of interdependence on different terms. I had the resources to help them if I chose to, but I also had the power to maintain boundaries and demand respect in ways that hadn't been possible when I was dependent on their support. The conscious choosing wasn't just about whether to attend Jessica's wedding or maintain contact with my family. It was about what kind of person I wanted to be now that I had options and influence that could affect other people's lives. Did I want to be someone who used success as a weapon to punish people who had failed to support me when I needed it most? Or did I want to be someone who used success as a tool for creating the kinds of relationships and outcomes that reflected my values rather than my resentments? The answer came to me during a quiet evening in my townhouse, while I was reviewing client files and thinking about the small business owners who depended on my expertise to navigate financial challenges that could determine whether their dreams survived or failed. Every day, I helped people solve problems and make decisions that would affect their families and employees and communities. The work felt meaningful because it involved using my skills and knowledge to create positive outcomes for people who were willing to trust my judgment and follow my guidance. My family members were facing the same kinds of challenges that brought clients to my office, and they were dealing with those challenges without access to the knowledge and resources that I had spent years developing. The conscious choice wasn't whether they deserved my help, but whether I wanted to be the kind of person who withheld assistance from people I loved because of conflicts that belonged to the past rather than the present. But choosing to help didn't mean choosing to return to old patterns of relationship that had been unhealthy for everyone involved. It meant creating new terms of engagement that reflected who I had become rather than who I had been when I lived under their roof and followed their rules. I wrote 2 letters that evening, both of them requiring multiple drafts before I found language that expressed what I wanted to communicate without reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. The first letter was to Jessica, accepting her wedding invitation, but explaining that my attendance would be contingent on mutual respect and acknowledgement that our relationship had changed in ways that required new boundaries and expectations. The second letter was to my parents, offering to provide financial consultation regarding their property tax situation without expectation of gratitude or reconciliation. I explained that my offer was based on professional expertise rather than family obligation, and that my assistance would be provided on the same terms I offered to any client who needed help navigating complex financial challenges. The conscious choosing had led me to a position I hadn't anticipated when I first received Jessica's invitation. I would engage with my family not as the daughter who had been rejected for failing to meet their expectations, but as the professional who had succeeded by exceeding everyone's expectations, including my own. The engagement would be on my terms, reflecting my values and boundaries, designed to create positive outcomes rather than settle old scores. Mailing those letters felt like completing a circle that had begun 3 years earlier when I walked away from Maple Street with everything I owned and no clear idea of what independence would actually look like. Now I knew that independence wasn't just about surviving without family support, but about choosing how to use the strength and resources that survival had helped me develop. The conscious choosing was about becoming someone who could offer help, without losing herself in the process. The transformation from survival to success hadn't happened overnight, but by the 4th year of independence, the changes in my life had become impossible to ignore or minimize. Torres Financial Solutions occupied a renovated storefront on High Street in Columbus's bustling business district, complete with modern office furniture, professional signage, and a reception area that projected the kind of competence and stability that attracted clients who needed serious financial guidance rather than basic bookkeeping services. My team had grown to include Jennifer Martinez, a recent accounting graduate who handled routine client services with impressive attention to detail, and Robert Chen, a former bank loan officer who specialized in business expansion planning and investment strategies. Both employees had been carefully selected not just for their technical skills, but for their ability to work with small business owners who often felt intimidated by financial complexity and needed patient, clear explanations rather than condescending lectures. The client base had evolved along with the business infrastructure, shifting from desperate small business owners who needed emergency assistance to established companies that wanted strategic planning and proactive financial management. Cedar Falls Community Bank had become a regular client, contracting with us to provide financial literacy workshops for their small business customers. The Columbus Chamber of Commerce had hired us to develop educational materials about tax planning and business structure optimization. Most significantly, I had been selected as one of Columbus Business Monthly's 30 Under 30 Emerging Leaders, a recognition that had resulted in speaking opportunities at regional conferences and consulting requests from businesses throughout Central Ohio. The magazine profile had described me as a self-made entrepreneur who built a thriving financial services firm from the ground up, demonstrating that success comes from combining technical expertise with genuine commitment to client service. The recognition felt surreal because it represented the kind of professional achievement that my parents had dismissed as unrealistic fantasy when I was 18 and desperate for their support. Now, those same achievements were being celebrated by people who had no knowledge of my family background or the circumstances that had forced me to build my career through necessity rather than choice. But the Phoenix Rising wasn't just about professional success or public recognition. It was about the internal transformation that had occurred as I learned to trust my own judgment and value my own contributions rather than seeking validation from people who had never been capable of providing it. The young woman who had absorbed criticism and internalized doubt had been replaced by someone who could evaluate her own performance based on results, rather than other people's opinions. The most visible symbol of that transformation was the townhouse I had purchased in German Village, a carefully restored 1890s brick building with original hardwood floors, exposed beam ceilings, and windows that looked out on tree-lined streets, where successful professionals walked their dogs and discussed neighborhood improvement projects. The house represented not just financial achievement, but also the kind of stability and permanence that had felt impossible during those early years of transitional housing and careful budgeting. But the internal transformation was even more significant than the external markers of success. I had learned to make decisions based on my own values and priorities rather than other people's expectations. I had developed confidence in my abilities that was grounded in actual accomplishment rather than wishful thinking. Most importantly, I had discovered that success felt most meaningful when it was used to create opportunities for other people rather than simply accumulating personal advantages. That philosophy had led me to establish the Cedar Falls Opportunity Fund, a scholarship program that provided financial support for young adults from working-class families who wanted to pursue higher education or vocational training, but lacked family resources to make those goals realistic. The fund had already supported 12 recipients, including David from my old transitional housing, who had used his scholarship to complete a construction management degree and start his own historic renovation business. The scholarship program had also brought me back into contact with Mrs. Kowalski, who had become the fund's primary advisor and advocate within the Cedar Falls community. At 78, she remained sharp and engaged, serving on the selection committee and using her extensive network of contacts to identify deserving candidates who might not otherwise apply for assistance. "Sarah, you've accomplished something remarkable," she had told me during our most recent quarterly meeting to review scholarship applications. "You've not only succeeded in building the kind of life you dreamed about when you were working in my garden, but you've also created ways for other young people to have similar opportunities. That's the mark of someone who understands that real success includes responsibility to community." Her words had reminded me that the Phoenix Rising had been supported by people who had believed in my potential when I couldn't afford to believe in it myself. Mrs. Kowalski had provided my first real job and invaluable business mentorship. Frank had offered professional development opportunities and trusted me with increasing responsibilities. Amy had maintained friendship and connection during the years when family relationships were impossible to navigate. The recognition that my success had been built on a foundation of community support rather than pure individual effort had influenced how I approached both business relationships and personal decisions. I had learned to identify and nurture the kinds of connections that create mutual benefit rather than one-sided advantage. I had developed the ability to offer help and guidance without creating dependence or undermining other people's autonomy. Those lessons had become particularly relevant as my business expanded and my role shifted from direct service provider to team leader and strategic decision maker. Managing employees required understanding how to delegate responsibilities while maintaining quality standards. Working with clients on complex financial planning required balancing professional expertise with respect for their knowledge of their own businesses and goals. The Phoenix Rising had also required learning to manage success without losing sight of the values and priorities that had motivated the original transformation. Financial security could easily become an end in itself, rather than a means of creating freedom and opportunity. Professional recognition could become addictive in ways that distracted from meaningful work. Business growth could consume time and energy that were needed for personal relationships and community engagement. Maintaining balance had required conscious effort and regular reassessment of goals and priorities. I had established personal policies about working hours and client boundaries that protected time for reading, exercise, and friendships that weren't related to business networking. I had committed to spending at least 10 hours per month on volunteer activities that provided direct service rather than professional development opportunities. Most importantly, I had learned to measure success by multiple criteria rather than focusing exclusively on financial metrics or professional achievements. The quality of relationships I maintained, the positive impact my work had on clients' lives, and the sense of personal fulfillment I derived from daily activities were as important as revenue growth or industry recognition. The Phoenix Rising had reached a point where the transformation felt complete and sustainable, but also ready for the next phase of development. I had built a successful business that could continue growing or could be maintained at its current level depending on my future priorities. I had established financial security that provided freedom to pursue opportunities based on interest, rather than necessity. I had developed personal relationships and community connections that offered support and meaning beyond professional accomplishments. Most significantly, I had become someone who could engage with my family from a position of strength and self-determination rather than dependence or defensiveness. The success I had achieved was genuine and substantial enough that it couldn't be dismissed or minimized by people who had predicted failure. The Phoenix Rising had created not just personal transformation, but also the possibility of transforming relationships that had been damaged by old patterns of power and control. The woman who had been thrown out for being good for nothing had become someone whose professional expertise was sought by successful businesses, whose financial guidance was trusted by people making important decisions about their futures, and whose community leadership was recognized by organizations committed to creating opportunities for others. The Phoenix Rising was complete, but the story it had created was ready for new chapters that could include family reconciliation on terms that honored both the past and the present. The phone call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning, in early spring, just as I was preparing for a presentation to the Columbus Small Business Development Council about innovative approaches to financial planning for startups. My assistant Jennifer had screened the call initially, but when she realized it was Amy Rodriguez calling from Cedar Falls, she transferred it to my office with the kind of apologetic urgency that suggested the conversation couldn't wait for a more convenient time. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I thought you should know that your father had a heart attack yesterday." Amy's voice carried the strained quality that comes from delivering difficult news to someone who might not want to receive it. "He's stable now, but he's going to be in the hospital for at least a week, and the doctors are saying he needs to make some major changes to his lifestyle and stress levels." The news hit me with unexpected force, creating a hollowness in my chest that I hadn't anticipated. Despite years of maintaining distance and boundaries, despite the conflicts that had led to our estrangement, Robert Torres was still my father, and the idea of him lying in a hospital bed facing his own mortality made all of our disagreements feel suddenly trivial and petty. "How serious was it?" I asked, setting aside the presentation materials that had seemed important just moments earlier. "Is he going to recover completely, or are there ongoing concerns?" Amy's hesitation before answering told me more than her eventual words would convey. "The doctors say he should make a full recovery if he follows their recommendations about diet and stress management. But Sarah, the stress part is going to be really difficult. Your family's financial situation has gotten much worse since we last talked, and the pressure of trying to keep the business running while dealing with debt problems has been taking a toll on both your parents." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Amy providing details about my father's condition and the broader family circumstances that had contributed to his health crisis. The construction business had been struggling for over 2 years, with several major clients declaring bankruptcy and leaving significant unpaid invoices. My parents had been using credit cards and personal loans to cover business expenses, creating a spiral of debt that had become impossible to manage. On their declining income, most critically, they were now 18 months behind on property taxes for both their home and my father's business property, with the county threatening foreclosure proceedings that could result in the loss of everything they had worked to build over 30 years of marriage and business ownership. "Sarah, I know this is complicated because of your history with them, but I think they're finally ready to admit they made serious mistakes in how they handled things with you," Amy continued, her voice gentle but insistent. "Your mother has been talking about how proud she is of what you've accomplished, and your father has been asking questions about your business and whether you might be willing to provide some guidance about their financial situation." The reversal was so complete that it felt almost surreal. The parents who had dismissed my business aspirations as unrealistic fantasy were now facing the consequences of their own financial mismanagement, while the daughter they had rejected for being impractical had built exactly the kind of expertise that could help them navigate their crisis. But the irony wasn't what struck me most forcefully about Amy's phone call. What hit me was the recognition that my parents' desperation represented both an opportunity for reconciliation and a test of the kind of person I had become through years of independence and success. I could choose to interpret their current situation as vindication of my choices and evidence of their poor judgment, or I could choose to see it as a chance to demonstrate that success had taught me compassion rather than resentment. The decision about how to respond required the same kind of careful analysis that I applied to complex client situations, weighing multiple factors and potential outcomes before determining the most appropriate course of action. My father's health crisis added urgency to their financial problems, but it also created emotional complexity that could complicate any attempt to provide professional assistance. After ending the call with Amy, I spent the remainder of the morning researching my family's financial situation through public records and online databases that provided information about property tax delinquencies, business liens, and court filings. The picture that emerged was even more serious than Amy had indicated, suggesting that my parents were facing potential bankruptcy in addition to foreclosure proceedings. But my research also revealed something that Amy hadn't mentioned, probably because she didn't have access to the same information sources that I used for client investigation. For the past 4 years, someone had been making anonymous payments toward my parents' property tax debt, preventing the foreclosure proceedings from moving forward while allowing my parents to believe they had received some kind of county assistance or payment plan arrangement. The discovery that someone had been secretly helping my family created a new dimension to the situation that I hadn't expected to confront. The anonymous benefactor had been providing exactly the kind of assistance that could prevent my parents from losing their home, while maintaining the fiction that they were managing their problems independently. The arrangement suggested someone who cared enough to help, but was unwilling or unable to provide that help openly. The methodology and timing of the payments indicated someone with detailed knowledge of property tax procedures and access to legal mechanisms for making anonymous transactions. The amounts were substantial enough to prevent foreclosure, but not large enough to eliminate the debt entirely, suggesting strategic thinking about providing assistance without creating dependence, or removing incentives for my parents to address their underlying financial problems. As I studied the payment records and legal documents related to my family's situation, a suspicion began forming that felt both logical and emotionally complicated. The anonymous benefactor's behavior pattern matched exactly what I might have done if I had been monitoring my family's situation and wanted to help without reopening direct communication or creating obligations that could complicate our relationship. But if someone else had been providing this assistance for 4 years, their current desperation suggested that either the anonymous help had stopped or the scope of their problems had expanded beyond what those payments could address. Either way, my parents were now facing a crisis that required more comprehensive intervention than anonymous assistance could provide. The desperate reversal had created a situation where my professional expertise and financial resources could potentially save my family from losing everything they had built, but only if I was willing to engage with them directly and risk reopening conflicts that had been resolved through distance and time. The decision wasn't just about whether to help them, but about what kind of help would be most appropriate and sustainable given our history and their current circumstances. I spent the afternoon developing a preliminary analysis of their financial situation and potential solutions, approaching their problems with the same systematic methodology I used for any client facing complex debt and cash flow challenges. The exercise felt strange because it required combining professional objectivity with personal emotional investment in ways that I had never experienced with other clients. But the analysis also revealed that their situation, while serious, was not hopeless. With proper debt restructuring, realistic budgeting, and strategic business planning, my parents could potentially stabilize their finances and maintain ownership of both their home and business property. The solutions would require significant changes to their lifestyle and business practices, but they were within the range of outcomes that I had helped other clients achieve when they were willing to commit to difficult but necessary adjustments. The desperate reversal had placed me in a position I had never anticipated when I left home at 18, with nothing but determination and a scholarship that I wasn't able to use. Now I had the knowledge and resources that could rescue my family from the consequences of decisions they had made without understanding the long-term implications. The question was whether I wanted to be the person who provided that rescue, and if so, on what terms and with what expectations for how our relationships might change as a result. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.